my pleasure to add my welcome to Jim's to St Andrews on the Terrace, and especially warm welcome to our panellists tonight. The Study Trust, and I'll introduce the panellists in a moment, the Study Trust board meets monthly, and we have lots of interesting conversations about what's going on in the world. And the election of Pope Francis a few months ago, a South American Vatican outsider, generated a very interesting conversation at one of our board meetings. And we wondered about his leadership style and the changes that he seems intent on making right from the start, when he symbolically refused the red shoes and the ermine stole of papal office. So we decided to explore the ideas of leadership, and particularly the connections between leadership and the institutions that people find themselves in. And so we have invited our panellists to explore the relationship between values and beliefs and leadership, as seen through the eyes of secular and spiritual leaders and an academic perspective. We thought about how Pope Francis, for instance, is actively pursuing his values and his beliefs in his new work as the Pope, and in doing so setting a tone for the entire Church. But we're also aware that he is likely encountering some quite powerful resistance to the changes that he envisions. In a similar fashion, the Dalai Lama is walking the talk, living his Buddhist values in everything he does, and inspiring a community that goes way beyond the traditional community of Tibetan Buddhism. Visionary leaders sometimes encounter intractable institutions which make it very hard for them to achieve their vision. Thinking of the US President Barack Obama, who's come up against both the Republican-led House of Congress and the institutional power of Wall Street. So how does a leader create change and still maintain integrity? What enables a leader to transform an organisation and its culture? These are issues and questions for leaders within religious institutions and within the secular world. So we have three very wonderful people who are here to share different perspectives on these questions tonight. First, in the middle, I'm going to introduce Dr. Allan Freeth. He's Chair of Housing New Zealand, and he has served as a Director for GNS Science. He's a board member of Save the Children Fund, a trustee and director of Crime Stoppers New Zealand, and Deputy Chair of Film New Zealand. And I had the pleasure of working with him on the Queen Margaret College, which is the Presbyterian Girls' School Board of Governors. Allan was formerly Chief Executive of Telstra, and he lives in Kandala with his wife and children. Next to me is Bishop Justin Duckworth, Anglican Bishop of Wellington. Justin was consecrated in the Wellington Cathedral in June 2012. Before that, he was co-founder and leader of Urban Vision, which runs houses in Wellington in which young Christians live alongside people who are on the margins. And Justin and his wife Jenny also pioneered Ngāti Awa, a contemporary monastery that's up the Kapiti coast and inland a little bit, a very beautiful place. And for an academic perspective on leadership, but one which is a very engaged academic perspective, my pleasure to also welcome Marjolein Lips-Wiersma. Allan is Associate Professor of Organisational Behaviour and Corporate Responsibility, which is quite a burden to bear, at the Department of Management at Canterbury University. She was a former Associate Editor of the Journal of Management, Spirituality and Religion, and has published numerous papers on workplace spirituality. And as I was reading about the work that she's done, I was particularly intrigued with the title of one of them, which was Theorising the Dark Side of the Workplace Spirituality Movement. So I hope that she gets a chance to share something about that. Her research on meaningful work is widely used by for-profit businesses and not-for-profit organisations. So I wanted to start by asking each of the panellists, and Marjolein will have a slightly different perspective than Allan and Justin as an academic, but in your experience of leadership, what makes a good leader? So Allan, could I ask you to start?
I'm sort of very representative, I think, of the dark side, or the evil empire, whatever you want to call it. May surprise you to know as such that I regard leadership in a slightly different way to traditional business thinking. I think leadership is inherently an emotional and even sometimes spiritual experience. And I've long held a personal view that organisations are not driven by missions, visions and rational decision making, but by people's emotions and what happened to them when they were 5. And if you're not convinced by that, at the end of the evening, if you can tell me what John Key, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama and Jack Welch of GE fame had in common besides the Y chromosome, it may give some indication of what happened to them when they were 5. Organisations progress as leaders come to understand their emotions, understand the personality, soul that they're nurturing through their work or their faith, and have really identified how they're going to make a contribution. The not so good leaders that I've followed, there's been a few of them, believe their power base gives them the right to be disrespectful and lack courtesy, and they're so often driven by their own emotional frameworks that their behaviour lacks consistency, which is a real killer for leadership, and they don't have any clear value framework. I want to be clear, I don't mind messiness around leadership. Life is messy, organisations are messy, it's tough, people are people, and we often rush to put people onto a pedestal before it's clear that they're real or they have staying power. But even in the messiness, there has to be a clear framework, a clarity of purpose. I guess good leaders I admire and try to imitate are the ones whose mission is to serve an organisation of faith, a purpose or an aspiration. And they show compassion even when they do stuff they dislike. They're brave even when they're terrified, and they're flawed, and they know they're flawed. But they have a really good sense of who they are and what they stand for. And good, perhaps great leaders are spiritual, and to me that doesn't mean religious. It means they have a fascination with the world, they're connected to people, they see issues, they're overwhelmed by the unexplainable, but more importantly they feel, they hurt, they laugh, and they're not afraid to show it. Good leaders make mistakes, sometimes they make big ones, but good leaders call it, so screwed up, sorry about that, let's move on. And finally, leadership is about storytelling. Good leaders are good storytellers and enrol people in their stories. Leadership is neither a science or an art, you've got to be a bit of both, a scientist and an artist, but the good leaders are people who have found the passion, their calling, and as Joseph Campbell said, the privilege of a lifetime has been who you are, and good leaders have just been who they are. Thank you.
Justin, would you like to?
Yep. Kia ora koutou, katoa mihi nui kia koutou. It's wonderful to be here. I feel a little bit like a fraud. I haven't really read many books on leadership, and I don't think I've been to many seminars on leadership. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what I've done in my life, and then maybe the next slot I'll tell you the things I've learnt. I think I learnt though most of what I know now about leadership just simply from doing youth work in my early 20s in Wellington, based around Newtown, Berhampore. We did youth work with a whole lot of volunteers and a whole lot of young people, and I think holding a team of people together on that task taught me a lot. From there, me and my wife and others pioneered Urban Vision, which is a movement of people who relocate to the margins of society in New Zealand, voluntary, and relocate to areas of need and share life there with struggling neighbours. And so we number around 100 adults who covenant voluntarily to relocate around New Zealand, and that's been going for about 20 years, and it's kind of totally self-supporting and totally voluntary. Also, me and my wife and others pioneered a inner city relational church, which started about 15 years ago, was for the street community, and it still goes to today, and where numerous people have relocated to Wellington inner city in order to share life with the street community, which is great. And the last 11 years nearly, we relocated up the Kapiti coast and started a contemporary monastery, where last year we gave hospitality to about 1,300 people and have a beautiful rhythm of prayer. But all these things over 20 years, all of them basically were done with no money, totally with volunteers, and just about all of them people said could never be done. And so I suppose, and now as of nearly 17 months ago, I became the Bishop of Wellington. I had never been on the payroll of the Anglican Church. I had never run a Anglican church as in a vicar or priest in charge. Had only been an Anglican for 10 years and only been ordained but self-supporting for 7 years, and out of their stupidity, I think, or a rush of blood to the head. Somehow I became the Anglican Bishop of Wellington. So that's kind of my story. So what I know about leadership is just from what I've experienced, really, and what I've done, and basically from the context of always voluntary and no resource and pioneering, really. So yeah, that's probably enough to start with, and I'll give you some other stuff later on.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me in this beautiful church. It's truly wonderful to be in such a beautiful building and to be here tonight. And thanks, Margaret, for inviting me and finding some wonderful co-panelists here. To be honest, I'm not really a fan of leadership. And so I too feel like a bit of a fraud in that I have to speak to something that I have very ambiguous feelings about. I have lived in Christchurch the last 13 years, or more specifically about 5 houses down from what used to be the Time Ball in Littleton. And one of the things that we experienced in Christchurch very specifically, that the people that we thought were leaders just fell apart, and that the people that nobody ever thought about as a leader just stepped up and did the most amazing and wonderful things. And to situate it in a person, I'm not so sure about it. It's something that sometimes people have, and then other times maybe people don't have. And some people get paid well for it, and other people might not get paid so well for it. So I'm a great believer in human potential and humans stepping up to the occasion as they are required and as they see the occasion to be meaningful and purposeful. From an academic perspective, we can always talk then about leadership, even though we might dismiss some of it, we can still talk about it. And it is interesting to see what we thought was great leadership in the 60s. One of the greatest management gurus, Drucker, in the 60s still said, a leader is just somebody who has followers. So that was just much more, command control. You were in charge. And as long as you gave a certain measure of fairness and a certain measure of clarity and direction, that made you a leader. And then we went more into leadership is more of an emotional process. It's more about people. How do you inspire people, engage people? We got really into the whole charismatic leadership idea, that leaders could somehow take people. And we started to, whenever something went wrong, we were all calling for leadership. We need more leadership. And nobody quite knew what that meant, but we knew we wanted more of it. And so it was and then we sort of started to move and went, well, that's all very interesting. But maybe, if followers are quite important too, maybe we need to start empowering people. How do we do that? Maybe the role of the leader is somebody who really empowers everybody in the organization. Then, of course, we started in the 80s getting the issues around, the most famous one around the Enron, where the two CEOs were so clearly unethical that we then started to define leadership by the moral qualities of the leader, and that became really important. And most recently, I think everybody has started to ask questions in my field of, what has leadership actually brought to the world? Have we gained more equity in the world? Have we gotten more community in the world? Have people become healthier? Have people become happier? Has the environment become more sustainable as a result of all the leadership we have seen? What are actually the real meaningful outcomes of leadership? And so we are now again asking different questions of leaders, more in terms of, what world is all this leadership in fact creating? So we've seen quite a change in how we have defined good leadership over the years. Next to that, we are now back to not empowerment, which is more, I have the power, and then when I want, I give you a little bit. But more looking now at how do we radically reorganize societies as well as organizations, so that everybody can really step into their full potential, and we're looking more at democratic organizations and where leaders get in the way of that and where they can support that. So we've really seen it's very hard to say it's one thing. We've really seen an evolving, and as humanity is growing up and changing, and we are expecting different things, I think, from our leaders, but also from ourselves, we're becoming more responsible. Just simply, we're all literate now, all those sort of different things. We are seeing that the purpose and demands of leaders and leadership is really changing as well.
Okay. So, Allan, I'm wired. I didn't invite you to represent the dark side. I was actually really impressed being on a Presbyterian girls' school board that you talked about being an atheist and also a person of spirit, and we had an interesting conversation about meditation. And I think there's a lot of awareness about spirituality and work too. So I just wondered if you would respond to the question about how you use your values and beliefs to show the way and inspire the organisations that you've been involved with, and what do your constituents see that you do that inspires them?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start with an example first up, and that is, if you haven't seen the YouTube video of Lieutenant General David Morrison's, the head of the Australian Army, statement on behaviour in the Australian Army, then I strongly recommend it to you. It's only a 2-minute clip. He went on ABC TV nationwide, very profound statement about standards in the Australian Army. And one of the statements he makes, which strongly resonates with me in terms of leadership, was he said, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And how often do we let a racist or sexist statement fly past us? How often do we walk past photos of half-naked All Blacks or Lady Gaga on the office cubicle? We allow the phone line on the customer desk to ring. We don't worry about employees if we keep them working late. Or we just let that staff member walk by in jeans and jandals on a non-casual Friday day. I used to follow them through Telstra and then stand over them and ask them why they're wearing jandals. Small things perhaps, but all things that add up to issues of standards and beliefs and values. And if you're the leader, they send a signal very strongly about what you'll accept about your organisation or not. I'm certainly not a perfect person. Many people will tell you that, especially my family. And I'm probably more flawed than most, and I'm not a person who's comfortable with conflict, which is a long story and what happened when I was 5, and it's all very boring, so we won't go there. But I constantly try to get enough courage to say no to behaviours I know are not right. And sometimes they reflect my views. That's one of the privileges of being a leader. You can say, I don't care. My mother used to say, I don't care who started it, I'm going to finish it. Well, because I was the youngest of 5 boys, you can imagine what that was like. Therapy is still not working, but we'll get there. So you can have that privilege, but there's also, you have to stand for an organisation, so there's a strong means of representing that. To make a stand on something means that you're going to put yourself out there, and I found that sort of by accident when I shut down the pornography channels on Telstra Clare's service, TV service, and hope if I'm still running it, I'd ask how many were customers, but I won't. Within about 2 weeks of arriving in the job, I'm not a prude about sex. I don't really care what happens in the privacy of people's bedrooms, blah, blah. But I do believe the porn industry is exploitive and damaging. I also more strongly believe that that type of material was very damaging to the Telstra brand. And given that half our employees were women, and given that we profess to have a family orientation, I just couldn't see the connection with what we were doing. The Shareholders Association came out and criticised me aggressively. I was on the front page of NPR saying, does this man have the right to decide what you see? In the Christian Science Monitor, I became the poster boy for a month. So it was a bit of a shock, to be honest, to people I didn't expect to support me came out. I've got to say that action changed the tone of the company. I had men in their 60s who had been responsible at our TV studios ring me and say, thank you, I'm sick and tired of having to load, because I had to load the videos every week and have to see that stuff. I think the thing that really did demonstrate values to our staff, and we never did it to look good, was Christchurch. We poured a huge amount of money and effort and people to it. We had 350 staff in Christchurch. And I think for the first time it was public. I'd always like to think that we were a caring and compassionate organisation, but if it was in the individual, you had to keep it private and sensitive if you were helping someone with cancer or some other issue. But in Christchurch, everyone saw it. And that really changed the tone of Telstra there again. The people who used to give me a very hard time about some of the things we did said, you know, that was fine, we get it. And I guess my last comments is, you know, the evil empire jibe. There's a lot of criticism about big business in New Zealand, but big business can do big things. So often the difference, they can cause harm, but the exact things that the resources that allow them to do that are the resources that can save lives and change the world. And the difference between them, two of them, is really the leader and their values to which way the organisation's going to go.
Thanks, Allan. Austin, would you like to reflect on that question?
Yeah, sure. Let me just give you some values that I think drive my life and drive, I suppose, any leadership that I show, and these are just kind of things that I probably only articulate now that I've sort of thought about them, and in no sense do I think that I get them right. I suppose the first one is, what drives me strongly is that I don't feel like I want to ask somebody to pay a price that I don't want to ask, that I don't want to pay myself. And I think in the context of my context now of sort of the Anglican Church and an institution, etc., with some very difficult decisions ahead of it, you know, at least I'm willing to myself pay the price. Then I have no mandate to ask anybody else to. I think another principle is you can't lead where you haven't been. And I think doesn't mean you have to be miles ahead, but you at least have to have I think, some insight of where you're going, so that you can take people there. I'm a strong believer that I don't trust leaders who haven't failed. I think it's scary people who have no concept of their own failure and have not analysed that. So I personally, that's important to me. I think integrity and honesty are the currency of leadership. So to the extent that one can be honest with oneself and one fellow colleagues and have integrity and a consistency, not always be right, but as Allan said, be able to recognise when one is wrong and have made a mistake, I think integrity and honesty are important. I suppose I don't know exactly where I got this from, but I suppose I've experienced different mandates for leadership. So I think a role gives you a mandate for leadership. I'm the Bishop of Wellington. It's a role. I can leverage off that role. I think gifting gives you a mandate for leadership. People who are gifted, they're likely to be able to leverage off that. Relationship gives you a leverage for leadership. If you're known by people and people trust you, that gives you leverage for leadership. But the one that I think hardly is recognised, and I think in many senses, at least in the world that I orbit in, which is probably the most powerful, is what I would say is whoever pays the highest price has the mandate to lead. And I think in the end, at that point, people will get alongside somebody if they believe that that person themselves is willing to live and pay the price for their strength, their convictions, as in the case of Allan did, obviously, in the pornography issue, as said. So other things is, I think vulnerability is a key attitude for leadership, and that leadership is a whole of life. It's not about what I do when I turn up at a meeting or in the office. It's what I do 24/7. And so how I live my life facilitates my ability to lead. I think other things which are important, I think leaders is only about really, leadership is directly related to your ability to form a team or to build community. So I think leadership is primarily community building and culture creation. And then I think those two things are so integrally important. So if you can't build community and you can't build culture, then I think it's problematic. I think you want a whole of life congruency between your values, your beliefs, your message and your lifestyle. I think that's probably enough.
Feel free, Marjolein, I was very aware that you're speaking as somebody reflecting on these conversations rather than someone who's had your own experience, so feel free to move this around in a way that works for you.
Yeah, well, one thing that is really interesting that is coming up is this whole idea of messiness and vulnerability, and with that also, I think, humility. And of course, that's a huge paradox in organizations. On the one hand, we all in organizations are wearing masks. We are not really ourselves. Where, being yourself in an organization can be detrimental to your career, can be detrimental to your self-esteem. And so, on the other hand, there's a huge price to pay, if we're just all pretending in organizations. And so that is a really interesting theme to come up. And I think when leaders are vulnerable and acknowledge that life is gritty and messy and not always pleasant, and sometimes even suffering, then what that is, it gives a huge amount of permission for people to be themselves. And it makes it real, because sometimes leaders can be sort of off the wall over there and talk all this inspirational stuff, and everybody else is just going, what? That's not how I experience the organization. But at the same time, sometimes everybody's here going, oh, let's get real, and then the role of a leader can be that you do need to create hope and a vision. And so, it's that constantly going backwards and forward and reading, what do people need? Because really, the role of a leader is to just serve what people need, and remove obstacles to that where things just get in the way of what they naturally do well. So that's an interesting theme, that whole theme of messiness and vulnerability. I think that we see much more of, because for a while we just put leaders up on a pedestal, and it wasn't good for them and it wasn't good for us either, because we refused to take responsibility while we put them up there. They had to somehow sort it out. And I think we're getting a bit more real about leadership, and it's very good for everybody, including the leaders. The other theme that is coming through is, how do you build community? How do you take people with you? And, we have all sorts of words for that, like distributive leadership. But how do you do leadership with people rather than to people? And I think that is becoming a very important theme that we see everywhere in community work. I think you see it in church work as well. We see it in organizations of really, we talk about shared leadership of how do we do this together, and whatever we find ourselves in, and particularly we're finding with issues such as sustainability now and huge inequities. Organizations that are really responding to that around the world. I've just had a PhD student gone around the world to exemplary organizations. They find that they say the problems are too big to still have like one leader and all follower models. We need many more people in the organization to become responsible and step into their own strength, just because of the nature of the problems, but also because organizations used to be on an island, and now they have all these partnerships with NGOs, with communities, with government, all sorts of, and you need different people doing those different things, and so you see much more. We're starting to refer to these as leaderful organizations. So they're not leaderless in that they don't have a leader anymore, but leaderful in that everybody steps up to the different roles and responsibilities that basically society and the environment currently requires of us.
I'm very conscious of these kind of conversations in my own life at the moment, thinking about leaving a leadership role here and going to a new place. And one of the things that ministers do when they start is have an induction service, and it's usually printed out, and you kind of have to say what they want you to say. But they sent it to me and I rewrote it. And one of the things that and they're going to let me change some of it, but not all of it. One of the things, the images that I felt quite uncomfortable with was the shepherd image, which has been sort of for so long sort of key in an image of ministry. That's sort of the one who, which makes everybody sheep. And I was thinking, within our own traditions and stories, there are lots of other ways we can have of thinking about leadership. And as a woman in leadership, I think the image of midwifery actually works for me much better, because in the end, it's not the midwife having the baby; it's the woman having the baby. The midwife is there supporting, and kind of at the end of it, the midwife's role should not be that obvious. The focus should all be on the mother and the baby and the father who was anxiously participating as well. So I think we need to keep sort of playing with the kind of metaphors and images that we've been given, and I really like that sort of idea of. I think the other thing you see in churches too is that sort of move from that the minister sort of being the kind of figurehead to a much more kind of collaborative parish council, lots of lay people involved and people, that sort of leaderful organisation. It's a great expression. So we'll give you all one more opportunity to speak, and then we're going to open up the conversation. This is, as Jim said, our last event for the year, and we're starting to think about 2014 and the rest time that we have at the end of the year, but also that time that we have to think about what's important for us in the new year. And so I wondered if you could just share some thoughts about what you think that New Zealand leaders should be thinking about coming into 2014. Maybe we'll reverse the order this time and let Justin start.
Okay, 2014, what I think my wish for leaders in New Zealand, I think my wish is that every leader in New Zealand would do the internal work in their life and would work out, ask themselves the question, is this all about me? How much of this leadership is about me? Where am I a slave to historical events that I'm just echoing in my new context? Asking those sort of questions, So why am I leading this way because I'm still have unprocessed trauma from past events, but I'm just living out again? Where is my value? Is my value, as Henry Nouwen would say, in what I have, and what I do, and what people say about me? Where are leaders finding their value? And I think as leaders do the internal work, I think they probably have the courage to do the right things at that point. But I think the internal work is important. I suppose a couple of other things, just reflecting on the conversation we've just had. Two things. I think leadership is about context, and I think it changes what type of leadership which is called upon in any context changes with time, and I think it's about knowing what is needed in the right context. Sometimes it needs a strong directional vision, and then in time it needs to empower everybody else to be seen and that leader to fall into the background. But I think it's about knowing the right thing at the right time, and what sort of leadership is called upon is important. I think the final thing I'll just say here is, especially I think for the next generation, it's interesting, this room is predominantly a certain generation, and I won't say what generation. However, I think it's different for a younger generation. And so a little thing that I kind of personally believe is whoever tells or lives the most passionate story wins the day for the next generation. And so the next generation is, I think, primarily hungry for passion and intimacy and vulnerability and reality and authenticity. And I think whoever lives that and tells that story wins the generation. And I think we see that constantly in the church. I'm not saying it's the right story. What I'm saying is if it's the passionate, authentic story, it ultimately wins the people. And I think that's something it's good to get your head around. Just a couple of thoughts.
Thank you. There's a lovely book, and I've forgotten the title of it, which is not good for an academic, but it Hope. And it says at the moment there are three stories coexisting. One of them is business as usual. We all kind of keep on going, put a motorway here, then we feel a little bit guilty about that and put a park over there. But essentially we sort of are living our lives as if we can always live our lives the same way. Then the second story is about the great unraveling, where, the whole world is just falling apart, our morals are falling apart, we as human beings get disconnected from each other, and our beautiful rivers and mountains and what have you are falling apart. And then there's a third story, that is about that this is a time for human beings where we are making some really important decisions, who we actually are and how we want to live our lives. And that is referred to as the Great Turning. And the author is Joanna Macy. I know that now. Good, I'm getting there. Yes. And the book is called Active Hope, because what she talks about, so my first wish for anybody in society, whatever we would like to call it, is that I think in this time we need to make a conscious decision which story we are living. Are we living with the business as usual? Are we living with the great unraveling, it doesn't matter anymore what I do because it's not going to have any effect anyway story? Or are we living with the story of we have some extraordinary opportunities at the moment to turn things around, and to really look at what is serving human well-being and environmental well-being, versus just what is serving the economy or the powers that be. And so I think that everybody at the moment needs to make a very conscious decision which of these stories we are living, because they're all true, they're all happening at the moment, but the one that's going to be played out is the one that we are going to stand in. And so I really think, that is the very first important thing. The second important thing, following on also from Justin, I've just spent some time with students in the US as well as with students in Canada, and of course I spent a lot of time with students here in New Zealand, is the next generation, and they're extraordinary. They really are. And so, I think another question we all have to ask ourselves, and then of course we saw that in Canterbury as well with the student army and stuff, how do we support this next generation? Where do we need to get out of the way, and where do we need to offer them support? Because their sight is really set upon the future. They are hopeful, and they have very wonderful organic ways of organizing. The one thing that you hear at St. Johnson from the student army consistently saying, we had no idea what we were doing, we got it wrong almost all of the time, but we did it anyway, Very hopeful, very active. And what young people know, I think, that people like me can learn from, is that hope doesn't come through, it can come through our spiritual and religious beliefs, and it does. But a lot of hope comes through actually doing and being involved in positive action. Just doing it one step by the next. And when you do it and you're involved in positive action, you get a positive view of humanity. And so it is also just about getting people involved in creating their own lives and their own future lives. And I think that's really important for leaders to not just what vision do we see to people, but how do we get them involved to recreate their own futures.
Wisdom for 2014.
Thank you. Yeah, 2014. Actually, I think these two have just saved me $120 on a therapy session. So thanks, appreciate that. A couple of asides. If you're still thinking about Bill Clinton, etc., all of them were brought up by either their mother or grandmother, and from their solo parents, and from the age of 5 were told they were going to be wonderful. And so this very strong inherent self-belief shows through all of them. Another aside, the business as usual. Any of you seen Harry Gordon Selfridge, a leader in his own kind, on Sunday night? That's his term. Business as usual came from Selfridge's. Somewhere when I was looking away in my life, I turned 50, and it's gone several years ago. And like any good male who's having a midlife crisis, I did what every good male with a bit of means does: you buy a sports car because it's less messy. But it was a time of reflection for me, and a poem by Derek Walcott, and I'm only going to quote one verse, really has resonance with me. And the verse goes, "The time will come when with elation you will greet yourself arriving at your own door in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome." And I guess a time comes when you have to face the reality of your life, and I guess what terrifies me most is I won't smile at myself. I've made a lot of money for corporate shareholders. I've made them billions of dollars. And along the way I've made a bit of money for myself. I've had a nice lifestyle. I drive a nice car, as I say, and I live in a nice house. But I have to tell you, none of that will make me smile when my time comes. None of it will. What I'm hoping will make me smile is the work that I've done with a whole set of charities around children, youth suicide. And what I've done's not been much, but I've tried to give advice. I've given a bit of money, and I've given some corporations money when the Australian shareholders weren't watching, and a few other things. And I've tried to do some stuff in the arts to help as well. So my resolution for New Zealand leaders is let's call time out. It's time. Let's be honest about poverty in our country and about the haves and have-nots. We are risking becoming a country of ghettos and gated communities. And let's be clear about child poverty and the consequences of that. Let's acknowledge today that a child is more likely to be sexually abused in this country than being left-handed. Just think about that for a moment. Let's face the statistics about Marion Pacific health and education issues, about domestic violence and youth suicide, about the fact that maybe crime has something to do with the fact that the bulk of the prisoners in prison can't read and write. You know? Maybe there's something going, and my friend Mike Williams and Tony Gibbs with the Howard League are pushing out retired teachers now to get the literacy up in prisons and try and stop reoffending. So let's stop. For business leaders, this is a message I've been giving to business leaders, not very welcome at times. Let's stop pretending that our responsibilities as leaders stops at profits, the odd community project and the odd sponsorship of a charity when it suits. For politicians, let's stop thinking about your own agenda, party's agenda, and being re-elected. I think it's time for a brave leadership model in New Zealand, one when leaders of all types of organisations are courageous enough to step outside their ivory towers and use their ability to do good. And that's going to require people like you and others to encourage them to do so. The behaviour or the situation they walk past is not acceptable, and it's time for them to step out of New Zealand as leaders. And who knows, maybe they'll get the chance to smile at themselves in their own mirrors when the time comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Allan. Right. Now we have an opportunity for you to engage with our very stimulating, thoughtful panellists.
Thank you. Allan, I'd like to comment on something you said about leaders having the strength to admit that we're all fallible, that we all muck up, to apologise and move on. And I've heard that before, and every time I hear it, I'm very depressed about it, because I think one essential aspect has been left out, and that is after the apology is making recompense, fixing things up, doing whatever can be done to undo the harm done by the mistake, and then move on. And always that, what I regard as an essential, fix it up, resolve it before you move on, is left out.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct, but I think when you're running an organisation like Rights and Telstra Clear, you make lots of mistakes and you offend lots of people. And I always try to go back and say, sorry, it's a bit hard then. You know, when you made really big mistakes, you're absolutely right. You've got to do something about it. And certainly, if you have customers, I think the point is well made.
Okay. I'd like to address the question to Margaret about the generational differences you identified, with Generation Y having a different vibe to perhaps other generations, and how you might facilitate a dialogue, for example, between the baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, and whatever you call those, the new ones, bubbling away with their new ideas, that is coherent and gives hope. And so that each generation, perhaps like the X generation, can give reciprocal hope to the baby boomers as well as they move to the next stage.
I think it's really interesting how different churches and community groups are starting to take on different models at the moment around engaging youth. But that from what I'm reading about them, all are similar in that they have a combination of spiritual teachings and having young people reflecting on who they truly are as spiritual beings, and alongside that having service projects so that they get an experience of themselves as somebody who can make a difference. And that the combination of that reflection and talking and in dialogue, and you would know more about that also with your youth groups, that seems to, where say in the 60s it was more activists were all going to do something and save the world, but that wasn't without the spiritual, that was mainly without the spiritual teachings. And then we went into a phase where we were all doing spiritual teachings, but without the action. And that what is really interesting about youth work at this time around the world is that those two things are being brought together, and that seems to be very effective. And also what is interesting in my own experience as a member of the Baha'i faith is that we see that it is no longer, a church here and a church there, but different, that the churches or religions becoming much more open to the community, and so it's not an Anglican youth and a non-Anglican youth or a Baha'i youth and a non-Baha'i youth doing, but they're all doing this together. They're just being drawn to these programs and talking together, and because of that you also create much more interfaith understanding, which is a very important skill, and intercultural understanding while they are involved in these activities. So there's a lot of very good activities around youth happening that are all based around quite similar principles. But I'm thinking maybe Justin wants to say something about it.
Just bouncing on from what you said, I think there's, I think historically we either get caught up on behaviour or belief. However, I think actually at this point in history it's all about belonging. So if you create a place of belonging, that's primarily what the next generation wants. They want relational connection. They want to be part of a group of people who are going somewhere. It's interesting too, and so we actually have some sort of robust dialogue up here as opposed to I probably might disagree with what you said, not in the principle of what you said, but the fact that actually in New Zealand probably most of the youth work and most of the significant groups of young people are actually the evangelical churches, which really aren't going into faith, and they're really not probably even being generous in their thing. And actually in reality, I mean, like in Wellington here, the Arise Church would get hundreds if not thousands of young people. So I actually think the idea that young people are going for this generic, generous, interfaith thing, reality is it's not true in the New Zealand spiritual scene. The vast majority would come from an evangelical. The vast majority of young people meeting within any sort of spiritual context would still be a closed set context, which I think is interesting to therefore say, well, what's happening there and why is that happening there? Because I think the values that maybe the generous values that you expound in that sense, I think are classic values that we talk about in meetings like this, but in the reality is, for that generation, they're not the values that are primarily actually the dominant values, and actually in more sense, if we're talking belonging, then there is a sense where belonging comes from having an identity which is a clear identity which isn't somebody else's identity. And I think that is an interesting dialogue, that everybody wants to fanatically support our all whites. It's not very inclusive, is it? I mean, we should be actually supporting Mexico as well. Why is there thousands of people walking past here in white t-shirts? Because we like the identity of being different from them, and it gives us belonging. And so I think that's something that we kind of have to wrestle with a little bit, because so I'm not quite sure what to make of that, but I just want to
I just want to add a sort of different twist to it. We're in the middle of a major social and technology phenomenon that's changing our society at the most basic levels. And I was just in Rome a little while ago, standing in front of the Colosseum and thinking about the youth, the famous quote by the Roman emperor of you can't keep the youth under control. All they could do was throw the earthenware jug at the centurion and run off. The phenomenon that youth are using, which is making us irrelevant, is this. And this is a phenomenon that's bringing down governments, will bring down corporations, because it's giving the geeks the power. And I live with a few geeks, 2 of my children are Asperger, and they know how to shut down websites if they had to. They could connect with enough children in their area to do a denial of service attack for 1 million PCs worldwide back on Air New Zealand to shut down. If Air New Zealand really pees them off enough, they'll go after it. Now, many corporates haven't caught on to this yet, and governments aren't, but this is coming. And the connection that youth is building, and for churches and for institutions, a dialogue that's happening around us that we're unaware of, because you don't tweet or you don't whatever, and I'm not that good at it either, you aren't in that dialogue. I think it's really important. And the debates we've seen recently about the people who unleash that power, the Assange and WikiLeaks, and now we've got Snowden and stuff, you know, it's debates about what this generation is saying is right and wrong. And it's fascinating.
Yeah, I think we see both of those things at the same time, that youth can really become quite passive consumers of belonging and spirituality at the moment. You know, I'll just turn up and entertain me and inspire me, and at the same time that they can, within a switch, turn into a very spiritually active activist, you know, and so we can't sort of find them in one or the other, but hopefully we can bring some of that. One of the purpose, I would think, of youth programs is to bring some of that together, you know, so that they can experience all those sides for themselves. Because if you, for instance, looked at the Canterbury scandal with the palm oil, that was you know, where one day they said nothing's happening, and the next day they said something else, and the third day it was basically they weren't committing to not using it anymore. When you looked at the activists, that was almost all people under 30 that had achieved that. So they're not passive, but they can do that, entertain me thing. Yeah.
Yep, I've just got a question around in a sense, the paradox of power. For good or bad, I've been, in a sense, one of the leaders of the unemployed and beneficiary movement for nearly 25 years. Part of the paradox of power is with our clients, and I would have had 30 this week, of many of the most vulnerable people in New Zealand, is trying to encourage them to fix the problem interacting with working income, IRD, whatever. They try to do that and they don't get their entitlements, and then they don't come back because in a sense they may feel that they've failed in some way, or they've trusted the institution in some way. I recognise with my knowledge of the Social Security Act, I have immense power in relation to my clients. So, and I struggle with, in a sense, that paradox of power, the empowerment model, and giving up to that. So I'd, in a sense, like some responses to dealing with that paradox, which I try to do daily.
Okay, there's a lot to be said about that. I think the hardest challenge is going to be with power is whether those who are currently in positions of power, are we going to wait for them to give it up, or are we setting up alternative systems? And I mean, so I'm just presenting two extremes, and there's a whole lot in the middle. But I'll just illustrate that with one example. For instance, in the Netherlands, you have, as you have here, community care. You know, it's done by nurses primarily. They were all in these sort of DHB systems, And we got a different government that said, well, if people wanted to try different models with this, they should just apply for money and see what happened. Now, what happened was that groups of nurses started to apply for money. And it was somebody who set this up, and they just started with one small group. And they have now in their thousands left the DHBs. They are back in the community. They are completely self-managing. They are setting their own salaries. They have no managers. They are just doing care in the community. They have no checklist of things that they are allowed to do when they go into somebody's house and things that they are not allowed to do when they go into somebody's house. They are completely free, basically, to determine the needs in the community and how they, as professionals, need to respond to it. Now, what they have found now after 6 or 7 years that this has happened, so they have there's 0 managers, right? So all they have is an email system in which they connect what is best practice, and they connect up. And what has now happened after 7 years is that the care has gone up, I think, with 40%. That they've now done 44% more care. The cost of running their operation has gone down with something like 40%. The turnover has gone to 0%. Everybody loves to work for them. And the client satisfaction has gone from what was it, 30% at the time to something like 90% now. So I'm just saying that it is possible, but I'm not sure whether it had been possible to have a DHB type system move from a very hierarchical system to that type of system. It seems that the more we see more evidence of people starting to pop up with alternative systems everywhere and taking back power, but that is then of course dependent on funding models and all sorts of things. It's not. I'm not saying it's simple, but I do say that across the world we are seeing movements like that happening very successfully.
Just a couple of thoughts, and I don't know if I believe them myself, but I'll put them out there. One, I think, is that I think for those of us who are in power and have power, which I think is everybody in this room, by the fact that we've turned up tonight, I think it's no point denying we have power or no point trying to diminish our power. I think the issue is for us to be responsible. Because as soon as we try to diminish or deny our power, it just means that actually we don't take responsibility. I think the fact is to realise that whatever power we have, we must be responsible for that power. And I think the second thing I'd just say is I don't know if power is a limited commodity where there's only so much of it. So if I empower other people, it doesn't mean I think that by very nature to do that I therefore diminish my power. I actually think probably in many ways if I empower other people, we just have more power in the world where more people can take responsibility and do more good things. Does that make sense? So I think often we feel like for you to be empowered, then therefore I must be disempowered. And I actually think, I don't know if I believe that. I think I have to be responsible for my power, and I've got to help you, whoever you are, to actually find the power to live the life that you feel like you need to live, etc., etc., etc. And so I think it's not a closed system with limited supply and demand. Actually, I think your power doesn't undermine my power necessarily.
I'm just thinking it gets quite messy quite quickly, isn't it? Because, for instance, I completely believe that you are sincere when you talk about, that CEOs need to do something about poverty, or at least not walk past it. But then we would all go, well, okay, then the first thing, living wage would be very helpful. And then you would go, yeah, but that's exactly where my shareholders are starting to
Actually, I'd agree with you. But and I have often said, I think we need to do that. So the issue is, how does the business model accommodate that? And the shareholders understand that that's going to increase the value. But not all of my colleagues would, by the way, nor would the business associations.
The living wage conversation in New Zealand has been a great example of how ordinary people can reframe a conversation. And
well, I think that's a good point. I mean, we only have power because people give us power. And I was thinking two things about power, two examples, because I can't add, these guys have done a really good job. I was thinking about when I went to the doctor when I was under 10. My mother used to dress me up. We always used to dress up to go to the doctor because that's what you did. And he had all this power. He sat behind his desk and stuff. Now you go to the doctor and whatever, and you say, no, Sally, you're wrong, because I've just looked up on the internet, and it says that's not right, and you have the argument with it. And I was thinking when I was a really powerful chief executive of Trust Bank taking my ADHD daughter, in this case, and how quickly my massive fatherly and executive power disappeared when she sat down in the waiting room of the doctors and refused to move to go and get her injection. That was it. I had no power at all. So, people give people power, and I think your point's great. You've got to be responsible. But I think that's what's happening. People are saying, actually, I don't know if that's right. We do want to live in nature.
I wonder if I can offer you a guess about Justin's question. I'm guessing that brute power by smashing people out of the way is a zero-sum game because there's a limited amount of stuff to smash, but legitimate authority probably isn't. And Allan has said that he wants brave leadership. By way of clarifying brave, I wonder if he could outline the alternatives, and by way of getting what he wants, I wonder if he could outline how he might discourage people from taking them up.
James, Peter, can you just bring the microphone back? Could you just break it down, James, into one question? Because I think you've got about 6 in there.
I think I had 2 that are related. You've said that the responsibility of business has got to be wide enough to cover income inequality and various related matters, and that would require brave leadership. I'm wondering what the alternatives are to brave and how they might be penalised or dissuaded so that it will be reasonable for somebody to pick brave leadership.
I'll try. I think we've come out of. It was a comment I was going to make on the previous question. Nothing's perfect. Democracy, organisations, whatever, and we all get through it. And what we're seeing, I think now, particularly probably with the power of social media, we're seeing a lot more dialogue and a lot more questioning of people's power bases. So the difference in leadership style that I had to apply from Wrightson to Telstra was immense because the average age was about 1/3. So the average age at Wrightson is about 68. At Telstra was about 28 or so. And the expectations of that generation were both, what was very demanding until the global financial crisis, and they all went to ground, and then they appeared again when they were sure they had a job. But the expectations of that was not only what are you going to do for me, but what does your organisation do for our country? And it was palatable, which is why the pornography, which is why the child's charities and everything became really, really important. That gave me some courage to say, actually, we should do, there's only so much I can do. And I turned down the membership of the Business Roundtable 5 times for a reason, and that I didn't agree with a lot of the stuff they said, although I believe in the market, by the way, but I think the market can't protect the vulnerable. That's part of the problem. So if leaders in business don't become brave, if they don't realise that to make their shareholders wealthy, they've got to make the community wealthy, they're all interconnected, then that model's heading the way of the dinosaurs. That's the point. And the pressure that will be brought to bear is the pressure I was talking about before, the youth saying, actually, we don't want to work for you, we're just not going to be there in your organisation because we don't like what you do and how you do it. And to be honest, it's a really uncomfortable place for a lot of chief executives. If I filled the room up with chief executives, there'd be very few who would be with me. There'd be a lot saying, look, Allan, I don't mind giving some money to a charity, I don't mind doing this and that, but hell, do I have to explain it to my owners, why we've done this? And I think it involves organisations widely throughout the whole of society saying, actually, we expect business, I'm talking from business, to do this type of stuff as well. We expect them to step outside. They might not be experts in it, but at least they can say, I'm part of this country. I have some influence to bear. I can get in the PM's office. Let me tell you, if enough chief executives goes in Minister Joyce's office and others, they'll start to listen. But it takes a few to turn up to do that. So I think we're at the cusp of it. I don't know, whether it's going to take another 5 years, 100 years, or whatever. But I do know that I just can't see where this stuff is going. And I think the challenges to leadership models from this stuff is immense. When I left Telstra Clear, we had 3 to 4 people full-time monitoring the stuff. Because by the time the issue got to the paper, it was 2 weeks too late. We'd lost our brand. So I don't think I answered your question very well, but and a lot of it's a uniquely personal thing. Are you prepared to put your head above the parapet and do it? I'm stupid enough to keep doing it and keep getting it knocked off, with lots of people saying it's not my place to do that. Others just aren't prepared to do it.
I mean, just a couple of things. I mean, I think, yes, we can ask CEOs, etc., to be very, very brave and courageous. But I think we, as everyday people with the limited power we have to create a culture which says bravery is the norm that we expect. And I think that's about us in whatever sector we're in, taking responsibility to say, actually, when is greed out of control? What is appropriate? What is inappropriate? How much is too much? And I think, we have this idea, I feel, that, it's up to the CEOs to solve it. It's up to John Key to solve it. But I think it's up to us to create the environment of the conversation where it is unpopular not to solve it. And I think politicians and business leaders will follow the population. If it's unpopular to not be paying the living wage, they will pay the living wage because it's the normal thing to do, which society demands, and that's the power we each have.
Yeah, and I think that that's sort of where we're also heading into the people power and the regulatory power, and of course corporations traditionally have not wanted to be regulated too much. But at the same time, we're starting, particularly with relation to the environment, we're starting to see a counter movement where the good corporations are now saying, can you please start regulating some of these things so that we can all start competing at a fair level, And what we, for instance, see around the world is, particularly not in Europe and just in Switzerland, that people are really saying, okay, since you haven't been able to sort out the salary inequities amongst yourself, in spite of our endless feedback on this, we now want to see regulation where, say, a CEO secretary salary cannot be any more than 26 times that of the lowest paying employee. And they are starting to drive through some of that regulation of just going, and that is where people are starting to take power politically, to just say, okay, you've now had 10 years to sort this out, we have given feedback, nothing seems to be happening through the market, something now needs to happen, at some other level. And similarly, for instance, all sorts of interesting things, but different things around the world with regard, for instance, here, the unions have started to have less and less and less power. Now, there's all sorts of issues around that. But, for instance, if in Belgium you want to make somebody redundant, you can only do that if you have the agreement of a union. And if you don't, you actually, in fact, pay a fine. Now, I'm again not saying that it should be done across the whole of the world. I'm just saying that people are starting to address specific issues through legislations, through other forms of partnership and collaboration and what have you, where people are starting to take back some power, and where CEOs from Freeth, the good ones, if we go back to good leaders, appreciate that, because it means they're not carrying some of that by themselves anymore.
I think that's definitely what happened with the Wellington City Council and the living wage conversation, because I don't know if people know that no matter who had got elected mayor, Celia Wade-Brown or John Morrison, we would have had a mayor who had made a public commitment to support the living wage. And that happened because there were meetings around the town, particularly one at St Peter's Church, where people of faith communities and other community organisations and labour unions, who I think are kind of working more collaboratively and with a bit more sort of spiritual awareness than they maybe have in the past, worked together to sort of show that people, that made it popular. And yeah, so I mean, it's amazing. And now the big challenge for the living wage community is to help the officials of the City Council understand that there is this popular political mandate, and to help them to work it out. But I've been so encouraged both by the partnership and by the power of the people to raise this as an issue, and it's a source of hope.
And I think you just put your finger on an issue. Often the power doesn't lie with who you think it does. And I was in Rome when there was a lot of criticism of the Pope about using the escort to whip around Rome instead of everything else, and the fact he was paying. And you could just imagine the machinations in the Vatican amongst the power base that this can't happen. And in the same way you've been told what you can say, and in the same way when I've taken on roles that you can't do that. Well, what do you mean I can't do that? Who said I can't do that? This man to my left is a hero in our household, because he's by action, like the prison thing with where everyone's saying you shouldn't be doing that. What do you think you were doing? We just think it's fantastic, because you're just demonstrating a whole different issue, and it's, as you say, the officials have to come understand, and they're resisting the change in the power. It's really fascinating. You're not often just dealing with leadership outside, you're fighting your own organisation internally.
Absolutely. Yeah. Which is where we started with the Vatican. Robin.
Thank you all for a very fascinating time. I'm obviously, leadership was something I did quite a while ago, even though I started here in 1964 as assistant minister. I won't give you my life history, but one of the key that I've learned as being a leader in the community and in the church and so on is encouragement is an essential role. And why is it an essential role? Because it builds the strength of the heart. And when leaders encourage people, they let loose a powerful, powerful force.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful conversation this is. There's one thing that I picked up as a theme is, Marjolein started with it, the messiness. And the messiness of the world we currently live in. And for me, what I see as a challenge of this day and age is, how do you actually give meaning to that mess? And to what extent is that the role of leadership? And I think, Justin, what you're doing in a way, what you have done over the years, is actually try and give meaning to stuff you see around you. Say, well, this is what I'm seeing, and people are asking you, what does that mean? Where do you want me to go? Help me. And you see increasingly people get lost. You see that in Allan's example with the digital area, or people got phones, and stuff is happening. It's happening so fast they don't know what to do. So what they do is say, well, maybe I need, come back to Justin's point, I need to belong somewhere so I can be safe. And I think somewhere there is something that leaders need to do to provide that sense of meaning and that sense of safety. And could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I think you're right. I suppose that there's a certain sense where I think leaders need to be able to interpret and give the terminology and the story that makes sense of that. And I think, I suppose those who can do that in this day and age will be the good leaders. And I think we're in a bit of a vacuum. I think we haven't got many leaders out there who are managing to articulate a story that makes sense of the mess and a story that makes sense of our role in it. And I think I think you're probably right that we are not also joining the dots that will between the issues of the different issues of the mess. So leaders are commenting on one issue of the mess, but I don't think we're putting a cohesive message together around where, the big picture mess and what we do and where we find hope in that, and where I think you're exactly right, and I think that is where we need to, we just got to, I suppose, hope that more leaders come on the scene who can actually articulate that. But I think you're totally right. Yep.
I like messy. I wonder whether to mess there is a standard answer, because that's exactly why it's messy. But I do think that as human beings we have to trust ourselves more that we can be present to it. That just by acknowledging that it's difficult and that we don't know what to do, we're actually not falling apart. And that whole thing of there has to be a crack to let the light come through, that there are many opportunities in mess as well. But at the same time, so a couple of things. I mean, for instance, in Christchurch, the other side of that is that I think we've become very tired of being to be resilient. Because at some point you just don't want to be resilient anymore. You just want to let go and say, I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm tired, and it's been enough. And so, and I think that's one thing, that sometimes we call for resilience and toughening up too early in processes. Or another thing is that when things are messy, we overlay it with a lot of frantic activity because we somehow want to put it right again without actually sitting down and going, it's messy and we don't know what to do, and so we see often a lot of frantic activity in organizations when things get messy, whereas in reality everybody's covering up that they don't know what to do. Another thing is I think Doc Heffernan spoke well about that, when they had that huge issue with this person dying when the power was disconnected, that sometimes when things get really messy in organizations, it is actually not leadership that knows what to do, but the people who are closest to the community who know what to do. So sometimes it is also about just looking elsewhere for answers when things get messy. And finally, but there's a lot to be said about it, there's quite a lot of research on organizational humility, but also personal leadership humility, but also where organizations becoming more humble in the face of mess. And to give one example, when we had the big tsunami in 2005, in Asia, and a couple of 100,000 people died, all these aid agencies went in, right, like hundreds, probably thousands actually, that went in. And years later they did research on who was the most effective with the least resources, and it had been those organizations who had gone in saying, we're here, but we have no idea what we do. Right, so there's all sorts of interesting, we're starting to understand more about how to engage with suffering at a personal level, how do you keep your heart open while that is happening, and also at an organizational level in terms of how to respond.
I think we're going to make, that was a very profound place to begin our ending, so I'm going to invite Allan and Justin to continue the profound thoughts on just anything that you would like to say to us as we conclude.
Yeah, I'll just sort of continue the messiness, but just very briefly. One of my staff members once said to me, you have a really easy job, it's just multi-choice, you know, people put options in front of you and you go, I'll go this way. We dealt with that issue pretty quickly and changed their belief system, but leadership is about ambiguity. That's what it's about. I mean, the best leaders are the ones who can deal with the mess, who have 100 things going on, paradoxes occurring, and one of the things, you know, we try to test in psychological testing is, can people handle ambiguity? This could be right, this could be right, this could be wrong, this could be wrong. And so every day is going to be messy in some form or another, and it's the way in which you find your way through that as leaders and say, you know, the evidence looks here, and I've been here before, I reckon this will do, we'll go this one. It's the long runs on the board that count. you know, I've lost a lot of money for shareholders, don't get me wrong, I've done big money, but on average I've made more than I've lost, which has kept me in the job. So for leaders, it's an ecosystem that, you know, everyone has to be there, and I think what we're in the conflict of right at the moment, and I used to say it at Telstra Clear, you know, eventually this isn't a democracy, you know, this ain't a democracy. You know, my job is to hear everything, to involve everyone, we'll do consensual, but at the end of the day, if I have to make a decision, I'll make a decision. I used to say, if you give me good data, hopefully I'll make good decisions. If you give me bad stuff, I'm just going to keep on making decisions here if I have to. So I think things are changing. I'm not sure where they're going, and some of the work that you're doing is looking at that. And but I'm really optimistic about it. I'm optimistic about the effects of institutions like this church, what Justin's doing and what others are doing. I'm optimistic about the way in which people are talking about the Pope and the Dalai Lama. You know, people are saying, well, actually, you know, some of the most insightful work that was done on leadership was by Goldman in emotional intelligence, and he did huge partnerships with the Dalai Lama. And when people say they know it all, you know, I just run a mile, so because you just can't. So I think there's been some real gems tonight.
I suppose in summing up, the question for me is, we need more good leaders. That's obvious from this conversation, I think, and we need more of them. So I think the role of leadership is to create leaders. So, but I think there's a few things, and it goes back to the comment you made, was it Allan? You made about encouragement. I think there's a few things in our culture which makes it difficult for leaders. And let me just go through them. I think New Zealand is a horrendous, has that tall poppy thing going down. Very destructive for leadership coming through, especially innovative leadership. Tall poppy, lethal. I don't know quite what it's about, but I think we have a real strong victim mentality in New Zealand, where people choose to live in victim and choose to have power over the world or influence the world from the power of the victim. And I think that's when one's identity is primarily negatively based, I think that's really problematic for leadership development as well. I think we have a blame culture which says you do all you can not to get caught for your wrongdoings. So we have all these institutions and businesses which spend so much time covering their butts, where I'm sure if they just own up, we could be a lot more efficient and effective. But I think we have this mentality that we cannot make a mistake. Making a mistake is lethal in this country. And yes, we have to put it right, but we never get to the point of even admitting we've made it, because we can't make one in the first place in this country. And I think that's lethal for leadership. Again, we won't develop good, innovative leadership while we can't make mistakes. Final thing is, and I don't know if this is true, but somebody said to me, you know, in New Zealand we have this saying where you say, I'm going to put that in the too hard basket, you know. what Allan has said about what we'd really love leaders to do, I'm just going to put it in the too hard basket. I had a foreigner who came to me and said to me, do you know, what do you say there? I said, well, this is what we say. And he said, do you know that that's only a New Zealand saying? I don't know if it's true. But he said it doesn't appear anywhere else in the world. We're the only ones who feel like it's appropriate to take difficult things and put them in the too hard basket. Everybody else in the world has to front up. I don't know if it's true, but I mean, nobody else gets to say, well, we can't solve these problems. We're putting them in the too hard basket. Everybody else has to solve them. And I think that's really problematic for us as a culture. We just sort of have this apathy that actually, it's just complex, so let's just put it in the too hard basket and it just sort of magically goes somewhere. So finally, the other thing I'd say is this. I reckon society is sick of words. We're sick of people talking. I think we're cynical and we've had enough of words. I remember years ago, I just got off the phone. I was doing phone conflict. Conflict's bad enough, but phone conflict is really bad. Only thing worse than phone conflict is email conflict. So I just got off the phone from phone conflict, and Jenny drove me to the airport, and I just was going to go away for a few days for work, and there's nothing, I just didn't want to go away. I just had this conflict. I was unsettled. I got to the airport. I said goodbye to Jenny. I was feeling miserable. Got into the airport, and my plane had been cancelled or something. So I'm sitting in the airport, feeling miserable. Feeling sorry for myself. The next plane's in 3 hours' time. So I think, what am I going to do? And so straight away I think, okay, I'm going to self-medicate. I'm going to go and find myself a curry. That's how desperate I was. I was even going to go for an airport curry. I know it's bad. That was how bad I was. So I went up to the airport curry counter, and it was closed. And so I'm just sitting there feeling so depressed, and I'm moping, and I'm just wallowing in self-pity about how bad my life really is. And as I'm sort of just going right down that wallowing pit, waiting for my curry place to finally open, this woman bowls up to me, and she kind of comes up to me, and she's smiling, and I'm thinking, don't you understand I'm wallowing? And she was the mother of one of the young women we used to foster years ago. And so she came up to me, and of course she engaged me in conversation, and I'm just thinking, I do not want to talk to you. But she just engaged me in conversation, and she kept talking, and finally I sort of said, so what are you doing at the airport? And she says, oh, I'm waiting for my daughter to arrive back, and this is the daughter we'd fostered. So I think, oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't seen the daughter for quite a few years. And accordingly she'd had a child, which is great. So the mother's talking to me, and finally the daughter's plane lands, and the daughter comes out into the sort of terminal area, and she comes up to her mother, and she gives her mother a hug. It's really normal. And I don't know what it was. I'm not normally a huggy person. I don't like that. So please afterwards don't all hug me. But I just thanks. But I just suddenly thought, I wonder if this young woman who we'd fostered all those years ago, I wonder if she'll give me a hug. That's all I thought. I wonder if she'll give me a hug. I don't normally want a hug. Never like hugs. But I just thought that moment in my life, I wonder if I'll get a hug. And then she turned to me and she gave me a hug. It was just a little thing. But I didn't want words. Words are so cheap. What I needed is I needed somebody to embody the hope I needed at that moment. I reckon that's what we need in leaders. I think we're sick of words. We need leaders to actually embody what we really need. And I think that's why, going back to, at the end, going to our Christian faith, I think that's why Jesus came in the flesh. I mean, God could have texted us or put up a Facebook page that said, hey, Son of God, do you put like? He could have done that, but instead he came in the flesh and embodied. He was the Word made flesh. And I think that's what we need this time. We need more flesh.
More words, but yeah, I don't know. Thank you to the three of you so much for such a rich conversation. I think I've been involved in the St Andrew's Trust for the Study of Religion and Society for nearly 12 years now, and I think this is the kind of conversation and event that we dream of, where we can bring together people from the secular world who do have a spirituality, as we all do, people who are identified as people of faith, and people who have been thinking and engaged in academic work on these areas, but who have a real passion for it as well. So the three of you have offered us so much, such a powerful conversation. I think that we really appreciate it. Just before we break, I have a little advertisement. If you want some more reading, Marjolein and Lani Morris, who is also here, have co-authored a book called The Map of Meaning, A Guide to Sustaining Our Humanity in the World of Work. And that book's available at the back for $45, and you can either pay by cash or cheque, or give them a business card and they'll send you an invoice. So I do recommend that as something to keep exploring, and there have been some other resources that people have mentioned. But as this is my final event for the Study Trust, I am absolutely delighted to have been able to chair this wonderful conversation. I think you, the three of you, and those of you who have participated, have offered us a great deal of thought and insight into something that affects all of us. And you know, we're all, whether our work is paid or unpaid, it is part of what it is to be human, is to work, and to understand ourselves as people involved in work is a crucial part of who we are. And we need the diverse voices to understand that, and to be reflective, and not just to be sort of passive consumers of the way things are, but to be transformative. So I think this is the resource for a transformative stage in our lives, and so I thank you very much.